The title of this little webinar that we're doing is From Innovation to Investment, so leveraging IP and AI to drive business value and build investor confidence. So thanks for Kate for the introductions. We've already gone through that. So we'll just click through these slides and they'll tell you a little bit about what the agenda is for today. So we'll talk about generative AI and its role in financial strategy. Thankfully, not too much on Gen AI because you've been told about it already. You all know about it. We'll say why it's important to talk about this today. So about the debt cliff that's looming in the US as an example. Then we'll understand the role of IP in business valuation and financing. That'll be Stephen. Back to me for leveraging AI and patent data to identify those high growth opportunities. And then back to Stephen to bridge that gap and tell us how do we bring this together practically. So without further ado, let's get into it. So generative AI, you know what it is. It's preeminent area of AI at the moment. It's in everything. Everyone's using it. Everyone wants a co-pilot. Patsnap are leading the way in AI tools and patent data. So it's revolutionizing, and I don't know if you knew this, but finance as well, by analyzing vast data sets and generating predictive insights. So the world's best investment bankers now are no longer people, they are AI models. So, tools powered by generative AI quickly model all those different scenarios. They identify patterns in financial performance, and they can assess intangible assets like intellectual property, specifically patents. So notably, these systems enhance the ability of companies and lenders, so bankers, to evaluate risks and opportunities in high-stakes situations like the debt cliff. So being able to analyze the complex IP landscapes, identify those underutilized assets, and propose potential monetization solutions and strategies, especially for refinancing, is particularly valuable. So in the face of debt repayments, companies can use this AI to quantify their market potential and their patents, trademarks, other IP. And Stephen's going to tell you about that next.
Thank you, Matt, and great to be here. Again, thanks to Patsnap for inviting me to do this. It's AI is an interesting area for us, both as a tool that we can use, but also as a tool that we've seen some evidence of our clients using, which sometimes doesn't fill us with confidence. You and I were just talking that I have seen some of our clients use what is clearly ChatGPT language in some of the responses that they give us around their IP portfolios. So yeah, that's just one to watch. If you're involved in a due diligence exercise, and someone's asking you about your IP, whether they're valuing it, whether they're acquiring it, or whether they're assessing it for investment, the last thing they want to see is responses that look ChatGPT like. It does not fill us with confidence, and it makes us ask more questions. And we've also seen AI be used in the data rooms that we're using now to support transactions, where we're able to check data or information given in one questionnaire versus a series of contracts, licenses, and patent agreements that also sit in the data room, where it's able to cross-check if we're getting consistency in the information that we're getting. So it's been really interesting for us as an operator, as an IP valuation firm, also working in due diligence, M&A, and fundraising and monetization. I think the things that you asked me to talk about and that people may find interesting is that, we've seen, not only do we do a lot of upside work in M&A and fundraising, we do a lot of work where businesses are in a downside scenario. And so there's more of a focus at that point on spending on intellectual property. And what we've seen recently is we've seen, innovative companies that have a great idea, filing a lot of patents initially, in terms of trying to get stakes in the ground, create that economic moat, or using patents to build out the economic or competitive moat. And when they've got money, they've just done a fundraise, it's all great, and they're spending money, building that portfolio, giving investors what they think investors want, and sending some signals to the market. But of course, as time passes, if the companies don't meet their forecasts, and therefore their their spending gets out of kilter with their income, then questions start to be asked. What is the, do we need more funding? Where's that funding going to come from? Where are we spending money right now? And what we've seen is that those companies who've been spending willy-nilly, filing without the patent strategy, they are often getting caught out because they're spending money, and investors are saying to them, well, why are you spending money on that? And why are we still spending money in those territories that we haven't done any deals in yet? And that doesn't look like it's adding value to the business model. So that's something that companies really ought to think about, is trying to get your IP spend and aligned with your business strategy and your goals on a regular basis, to make sure that you're making good, smart financial decisions. The other things that I've seen where that's relevant, again, on this theme of making smart financial decisions around IP, is we've seen some examples of tech companies or technology companies who've been working with early stage customers on pilots, on development projects, whilst they're still developing their IP portfolio. And often what we've seen is they get a little bit sidetracked by those projects and maybe don't continue to build out the portfolio the way they said they would, and they don't pay as much care and attention to portfolio development. What we've seen is when those companies come to get into, and there's more and more companies now, we all know about the issues around funding shortfalls, the lack of investment in the market, the lack of M&A and valuations to give the market confidence in exits and IP-rich companies, and therefore as a result, there's just not the same amount of money floating around to invest in companies at the valuations that they want. And so when they're working in these, often these innovative companies are chasing IP, chasing products, chasing product development, chasing new customers, chasing new partners to try and validate their IP, try and accelerate the business model. And that is great in terms of proving the IP works, getting to a full commercial development. But the key, that could be critical going forward when it comes to fundraising, because investors want to know about that. They want to know, hey, which third parties have almost validated your IP? Which customers have validated your IP? And if the business is getting into financial difficulty and is thinking about an additional fundraise, at that point, the IP that's focused on projects, the IP that's focused on partner developments, the IP that's focused, that's going to give them a lead into fundraising or revenue, more importantly, that's the IP to focus on. So as a result, you then got to look at the rest of the IP portfolio and say, is that relevant right now? Should I shut down or pause payment and development of that portfolio? And can I use AI and analysis to actually quickly identify where we might be spending money that we don't need to? And we ought to really focus on the IP that's going to get us quicker to revenue, and it's going to get us more quick. It's going to get us the backing and the support of investors and funders. So yeah, there's lots of ways where we can be smarter about how we spend money in IP, depending on the situation that you find yourself. And even if you find yourself in the back foot because you're running out of money and you're trying to make more difficult decisions, analysing the portfolio, working out what's best for investors and lenders, because it leads more quickly to money and revenue, is important. And maybe, rethinking your IP strategy, where you could be spending money in areas you don't need to, and you need to do the analysis to help you make those decisions.
Yeah, that's right. And so with the two examples we've got there, so one is the patent cliff, especially in biopharmaceuticals and drugs. Next year, 2025, there are going to be quite a lot of superstar drugs that become off patent, and therefore the generics are going to take a big chunk out of the revenue of these companies. And then there's also the COVID repayment loans. So the companies that have been leveraged for the last 4 or 5 years are going to have to start repaying. That's not to be said about everything else that might be happening in the world next year, but finance and debt is going to be very important.
Yeah, no, for sure. And we are already seeing investors and lenders becoming aware of those issues and trying to prepare for them. I mean, so much so, and even advisors are thinking about it. The backdrop is, certainly here in the US, I'm based in the US office at Metis. We've obviously got a well-established UK team, but here in the US, there were a whole bunch of COVID loans that were pushed out to businesses backed by the government on 5-year terms. Those loans are all up for repayment. They had been interest only up until now. And there's a bullet repayment that's due next year, and advisors, restructuring advisors, are looking at that, saying, "Hey, is there an opportunity that we can go in and help some of these probably mid-market and larger companies? Is there an opportunity for us to go in and help them do some financial restructuring?" Because of this debt issue and this credit issue they're going to face. We've also been talking to lenders who are asking us to help them prepare for that by helping them understand how they might refinance or manage these balloon payments that they know their customers, their borrowers, can't make. And in both cases, IP is sharply in focus, because in both cases, the questions will be asked: what collateral do you have, and what collateral do you have that's free of lien? So most of these businesses will have committed all their assets to a lender already. Many of these companies will be intangible asset rich companies, and they won't have the reliance on physical assets like real estate and plant and machinery and other assets that banks and lenders are looking for. So as a result, the intangibles and IP will be sharply in focus. And so businesses need to think about, hey, in anticipation of having a credit event that we need to manage, we really ought to get our IP house in order. And what we've seen is that regulators in the US are now pushing for that to happen from the borrower side. From the lender side. There was regulation that came out at the beginning of this year, which was encouraging lenders to. I'm sure many of the audience will fit this box. So the regulation was for lenders who are lending on a venture product, a growth finance product, or a tech finance product. And I'm sure many of the audience will have those types of funding solutions behind them. The regulators are now saying borrowers need to understand the IP as collateral. They need to understand the portfolio as an asset that could be sold in a downside scenario. And so we've started to get demand from the lenders for benchmarks that they can use to begin to analyze their borrowers and the IP portfolios. So understanding what your IP is really important in anticipation of credit markets and financial issues that are going to happen going forward.
Yeah, I think you're quite right there. That's that understanding, and that's where generative AI really comes into play here, especially incorporating those AI-powered IP evaluations into finance management. So what you can do is optimize evaluation reports using data-driven insights into commercial potential of patents, for example, or for trademarks. That gives lenders confidence. You can simulate growth scenarios by saying how your unique assets, your patents, might perform in diverse market conditions, and that will help secure or rescue growth financing. Then you can streamline negotiations as well. So actually automatically produce these reports and provide them as a competitive advantage, because it can be done quickly. So I think now we've talked about it, generating that bridge between technical IP data and financial strategies using Gen AI. That's holding the key to helping solve these financial pressures intelligently. So probably leads you into your next bit, understanding the role of IP in business valuation and financing, which you've covered a bit, but you've got a slide here that you can talk through, or keep telling us via the anecdotes.
Yeah, sure. And I think that one of the things to think about is that as lenders and investors become more sophisticated about IP, their understanding of IP and their ability to secure IP to support their investment in or their lending to, a tech or IP rich business, they're doing that, one, because regulators are pushing them, but two, their credit teams want to understand, how does the IP underpin future cash flows? Will they have the right IP as they broaden the business to operate in new international markets? Do they have the right IP in place to extend the competitive moat to those markets? As they enter those new markets, how are they going to price their products? And does the IP give them the leverage to manage pricing, manage margins better? Ultimately, coming back to cash flow, these things all come back to trying to predict reliable cash flows, and the importance of IP and the ability of IP to protect and influence future cash flows. And so that's important from the borrower, from the company side, that the CFO wants to know that, and the tech teams want to know that, and the R&D teams want to know that, because ultimately they want to be confident that the budgets that they've got and the funding that's been forecast in R&D and IP will continue. And so they should want to know, they want to know that the company is going to meet its forecast going forward. The CFO wants to know that, and then the investors and the lenders want to know that as well, and they want to know that IP is the underlying asset that can really influence that. And you can use software and AI to give people more comfort in the connections between IP, future performance, and cash flow. I think the other things that I've seen, and I wanted to share just on this, is, and it just came up recently. I've seen this, and there may be listeners out there where you've got heavy tech companies that are involved in software, hardware tech, and as a result, the R&D teams and the tech teams just talk about technology. I've seen this recently where actually they've missed the opportunity to think about brand. And although we all talk, and often when people think about IP, they think about patents and technology and R&D, and they maybe ignore brand. But brand is such an important intellectual property asset. It's usually one of the most quickly understood IP assets, because we're all consumers. So we understand brands, we understand the value of brands, and we understand the importance of brands in the market. I've seen tech companies talk to me about, we've got this software platform, and then we've got this analytics solution within that, and then we've got this database driven product within it. And I'm like, look, that all sounds great, but incredibly boring. How are you going to get the attention of the market? How are you going to get the attention of the board and the C-suite about what they're spending money on? Have you thought about creating brands for these products or these services, registering trademarks and getting recognition in the market? The sooner you do that, there are internal benefits, because you get the internal recognition from the C-suite, so that they don't have to talk about software and data and platforms and solutions. They actually have a name for it. Oh, it's the blah that we're talking about and investing in. It's the blah blah service that we're investing more money in, and hiring more people and filing more patents to support that. And so those are great internal benefits that you get by putting brand names around products and services and technology. And then there are external benefits because it makes them more quickly understood by lenders and investors. And then when you come to launch products and services around them, you may have the opportunity to add premium pricing and add a bit of margin because you've built a brand value and some brand IP around the R&D and the technology. I've even seen that used to good effect, where businesses have been filing patents, but they created a brand in anticipation to represent what the patented technology was going to be, and they've registered the brand to build a reputation about the technology that they're developing and that they filed patents on. So as a result, they're already building demand and interest in the market, even though they haven't got the patents and even though the technology isn't finished, but it's built around the brand. So I would, although there's a lot of people here, focused on R&D and used to talking about IP in terms of patents and R&D, please don't ignore the value of brands, both from an internal point of view and an external point of view. And when it comes to lenders and investors are consumers as well. And so they recognize brands and they recognize the importance of them and how they can be secured as collateral and how they could be valuable in an upside and a downside scenario. So sorry, I just wanted to get that point in. Just coming back to your slide, this is something that we've used effectively, and our clients have used effectively when they are trying to demonstrate value creation, both internally to the board, to their senior managers, and then ultimately to the C-suite, but also to external parties as well. Often the measure of the value of IP is down to income generation or even profit and margin. But if you're pre-revenue or you're loss making, it's often quite difficult for the IP creators and the IP originators to demonstrate value, and they're often feeling that they're on the back foot, but when trying to justify the continued investment in IP. And so a slide like this can be really effective in helping people helping those parties understand that commercial milestones that you're achieving are underpinned by IP milestones that you're achieving at the same time. And therefore, if you can demonstrate a link of value creation through IP milestones enabling you to achieve commercial milestones, then people should be able to, both the C-suite and external parties, should be able to make the connection between IP, commercial value, and then ultimately future revenue generation, which is usually the ultimate measure of the value of IP. So yeah, it's just about, I think the key thing here is really helping stakeholders and external parties understand value creation doesn't just have to be measured around income and profit. And in fact, one final quick story on that, we're working with a large industrial business who actually are under contract to deliver services, and they've not been set up to make profit. As a result, their performance of their business is linked to a series of KPIs. And what we've helped them do, and what they found was really valuable, was being able to demonstrate IP creation and IP management and how that impacted positively on the achievement of their KPIs. And so they were able to map IP creation and IP value to KPIs, which are non-financial KPIs. So again, when it comes to IP value, IP creation, you can be creative in helping people understand the value without the focus always being on profit and revenue.
I think Matt is having some technical difficulties. He's been in a storm, but I can hop in and help out. We have had some questions come in, so maybe.
Yeah, do you want me to look at those?
Yeah, I can read them out to you. We've had quite
Please do.
So a slight pivot, but the joy of live events and Wi-Fi. But firstly, we have, barring we have Matthew back, but we'll start with a question anyways. What are some examples for benchmarks for IP portfolio valuation, and how often should IP portfolio valuations be updated?
So really good question. And it all depends on the use. Is the valuation for internal purposes or external purposes? What I can tell you is where we do work for venture lenders, they often seek a valuation at the entry point when they lend money for the first time. To give them a sense of what's the value of the IP now on a fair value. So that's the upside value. At that time of lending, they also want to know the downside value. So that would be an OLV or FLV. And so at the point of investment or lending, getting a valuation is important. Also, they're obviously now locked into IP benchmarking and IP scores, particularly where lenders and investors want to track registered IP, which they can take security over. So they're interested in what are the key patents, and should I be registering an interest in taking security over those? What are the key trademarks? Is there a key bit of software that actually we want to put in escrow, and we want to ask the company to put it in escrow? And that's done. So IP benchmarking is important at the start. IP valuation is important. As the business grows, then getting an IP valuation every year, is that really necessary? I don't think so. We don't encourage lenders to do that because ultimately the IP valuation will change in line with the performance of the business. And if the business meets its forecasts and grows in line with the expectations, then the likelihood is, let's be honest, the IP value is going to go up. So getting another valuation may not seem necessary at that time, but what they do want is lenders do want to see those IP scores being done. They want to see that IP benchmarking being done. They want to know, hey, are the portfolio of patents that we've got security over, are they still in force? Are the portfolio trademarks still in force? How does this company's IP portfolio benchmark against others in the portfolio and others in their sector? So yeah, getting a valuation is important at the beginning, but getting the scores and the benchmarking is important at the beginning, and then repeating that, say, every 6 months, every 12 months is important. And I'm talking about my experience of what investors and lenders are looking for. From an internal point of view, again, having an IP valuation every year could be important, but I think ultimately what's more valuable, and certainly in the experiences I've had with the C-suite and management teams I've worked with, is that just having a better understanding that the IP portfolio is growing in strength and is moving in the same direction of the business is more important than getting that evaluation of it. That to me is something that's more valuable from a reporting point of view. So that IP benchmarking every 6 months internally, reporting the IP strategy and IP development in line with the business strategy, that's probably more important than getting a valuation every year internally. Hopefully that's answered that question.
I think so. And I think despite some storm Wi-Fi knockout, we've had Matt rejoin us so we can get back to our regularly scheduled programming and circle back to the rest of the questions at the end. Sound good?
Nope. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Stephen. Sorry about that. Yes, Storm Dara has run amok on my internet connection. So if it goes out again, then we know why. But yeah, I think from what I caught on the last bit there, we're about ready to move into talking now about metricizing, valuing, and understanding how you get there practically. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. So how do I actually use AI and patent data to identify those high growth opportunities? And I'm going to cage just a little bit around the idea of finding alpha. So if you're a quantitative analyst or you're an investment banker, or you just really want to understand what they're doing to identify the value in your patents and how they go about that process, then this is a way of how it's done. Now, AI tools shrink the first 4 steps that I'm going to talk about into a snap of the fingers, which is great. But as I think you've heard from the earlier calls, you really should understand what your AI is doing. And actually, it can be broken down into mathematics pretty much. All it does is do it a bit quicker than the human. So, it is much better at that. And therefore, we'll talk about why we do what we do and how it does that. So, from a understanding it, to gain some alpha, to get those signals that make you think I want to invest somewhere, you're probably going to want to start looking at your sectors and your industries, and that can take the idea of it could be anything from software to clean energy to biotechnology, whatever it is. You need to understand the broad scope of who's there, where it is, what's happening, etc. So from patent data, identifying key players. Those are the ones that have a high number of patents, for example, or patents in key areas of the industry you're looking at. You can track those ones that are emerging, so you can see it over time. So you get a time series type of data as well as point in time data, and you can say, in 2020, company X was the highest, but then in 2024, someone else has taken them over, and therefore we're looking at those trends that are emerging. Those competitive dynamics as well. You might see mergers between companies, and so you can sort of engage in whether there's disruptive threats potential as well. One of the things as well that is very hard to do before the advent of Gen AI is that a lot of things were good at depth, but not so much at breadth. Gen AI actually is quite good at breadth. So when you have patents and you have companies, and then you have something like regulatory data, they used to be quite discrete. Yet from a professional's point of view, they needed to know them because they had a heavy impact. Old types of AI and sort of depth-based learning models would have been really good in one or the other, but not being able to join them together. Gen AI allows you to merge those together. So now you get to the idea of this person's filing a lot of patents, they've merged with this company, and these regulations are coming out. What does that mean? So that's the first step, and Gen AI answers that for you. So the next step then is looking, know who the players are, the environment they're operating. That used to be the old way of doing things. We all, I suppose, remember using Boolean operators and going, software and this and this, and IPCs and keywords. So that's where we used to do it. Gen AI is, natural programming language, and you've got NPL type interfaces there. So you can just ask it the question and it will come back and go, tell me about patents that are related to golf clubs, for example. You don't need to have a really convoluted and complicated search string to do that anymore. You narrow those searches, you choose by dates, etc., and you analyze the results. And this is what we're getting to next. Where you have quantitative metrics, you're starting to get some type of qualitative analysis out of generative AI because it pulls together in things that look vaguely human. Underneath it all, it's not a human doing it. It's saying it's basically a really smart random number that goes going to be this by tokenization. But we're not going to dig into the actual how it works right now. We're just going to say how it's getting to where it's getting to. So with those patents as well, now you've got to understand, what are the trends, what are the key players, what are the citations that you can get as well. That goes that you get. What does it mean? So once you know what they mean, you apply those quantitative techniques, and you look at the qualitative techniques as well. Actually, when you're a person, you want to visualize them because you can check on lines on Excel and you can go through that, but it's not particularly fun. Right, so you want to be able to visualize them at the end, and that's what, again, Gen AI does. It'll make your pie charts for you. It'll make your graphs. It'll show what you need to know quite simply. So once you've done that, you found the patents, you know what the patent means. In a way, attorneys, don't worry just yet. They're not coming for your job, but they can summarize claims. They can summarize abstracts. Probably a lot of the attorneys that are working on here might use tools to help them draft now. So you can give it the inputs, but you still have to do the fine-tooth comb at the end. But what does that mean? So once you've got all that data and you've got those quantitative metrics, you've got those qualitative metrics, you're evaluating those companies to really understand who they are, where they are, should I invest in them? And as I said, what we do with Gen AI now, it allows you to pull together other areas of information as well, like financial metrics. So as Stephen will tell you, you might have lots of patents, but your company might be going under. So how do you rectify the two? So that's what we're trying to look for there. And therefore, that's where I would put AI tools. Actually, I said right at the beginning, the best investment bankers are now AI generated entirely. But I will say, however, for making investment decisions, actually you want a person at the end, someone like Stephen, who takes control of all the tools to really get there faster, but then has the expertise at the end to make those decisions. So as I said, it's important to note that patent data, any type of data, is one of many factors that should be considered before making any type of investment decision. But just to show how well you can do in terms of patent data and looking at things, Patsnap a couple of years ago did a model which we made based on investments on. So for those that aren't financially savvy, what we'll say is that the goal of the portfolio is to perform better than the standard benchmark. That's the Russell index in terms of overall risks and risk-adjusted returns. So while keeping the ups and downs to as small as possible. So the strategy was built by looking at this pattern. So and that basically what we found is that you can outperform it by basing on data. That leads me back to Stephen before my internet.
Right. Goes. Okay. Thanks, Matt. If you go back to that previous slide, I just wanted to chime in on that, if you don't mind. So, it does take me back reading about the Sharpe ratio. But then when we read the other bit of narrative below that, what we're talking about here really are quantitative and qualitative factors around the patents and the patent portfolio, and they can be important if you're able to translate that into a narrative that both the C-suite understand, because often a lot of them are not R&D focused and don't understand IP. The CFO might know what you're spending in IP. The chief marketing officer or the head of marketing may know what IP is important in helping them sell products and services and maybe keep competitors out. The chief technical officer on the board, the head of R&D, who's maybe got a position on the board, they certainly will know what you're investing and what you're spending money in. But then when you've got the head of HR or maybe the non-exec directors, they're probably not, unless they've got a specialist knowledge, they're not going to understand qualitative and quantitative patent data, citation analysis, forward citations, and the family sizes, etc., etc. So it's really important to understand that this information and this technology and these reports are good at one level, but you need to add more color to them and present them within the context for the non-IP parties, the non-IP stakeholders, the non-IP C-suite members who really need to understand beyond the technical stuff like this. And that kind of takes me into the next topic, but also there was a question asked, and I was just looking at it there, which was around using IP value or IP valuations being undertaken by AI or using AI. One of the things I can say from my own experience is, if garbage in, garbage out, we all know that old chestnut. If you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to get the right answers. Let's be honest. We, in our IP scoring system, we've got an IP scorecard that we've developed over 8 years now. It's a unique scorecard focusing on 5 IP asset classes. And we've had to, as you might expect, we've had to refine the questions over the last few years, particularly in the trade secrets category, as trade secret protection has become, there's been a greater awareness of it and legislation put in place in the UK and in the US and other territories. So as a result, the question set has to evolve. But people have often said to me, hey, I know you've got a team doing that. Why don't you just do it all online and just have people answer these questions random, behind their desk? And I said, because it doesn't work. not everyone who's behind the desk answering the questions has the IP knowledge. If you put the CFO in the room and say, hey, can you answer these questions about IP? He won't be able to answer them all. If you put the R&D guy in, then they won't be able to answer all the questions, because the questions will be a mixture of IP in relation to investment, IP in relation to brand development, protecting products and services, IP in relation to a database, the identification and protection of key databases within the business, potentially protecting his trade secrets. So it proves that really, if you were to do this online and you were to do benchmarks and ask questions online, you'd need to have about 5 or 6 people from each company sitting at the PC talking about the question and the answer to it, so you get that well-rounded answer and understanding. And I'll give you one example. When we ask companies, hey, do you, opening question, do you have trade secrets? And usually the response is, yes, we do. That's great. Do you have a trade secrets policy? Yes, we do. So, and that would be great. And if that was done in a computer and it was in, it was a question set, those would be 2 ticks in the boxes. The next question my guys say is, well, what does that trade secret policy mean? Can you tell me more information on the policy and what that means to you? And usually they say, oh, well, we've got trade secrets noted in the employee contracts as a piece of IP that's owned by the company. So it's in employee contracts. Okay, well, that's a good start, but that doesn't itself constitute a trade secret policy. And then you get into a question and answer with the management team again. So what are the trade secrets? Can you give me the headlines? We don't need to know the full trade secret, but give me the headlines, and then tell me, how are they used in the organization? And then how are they protected? Do you have a register of them? Who's that register managed by? Are the trade secrets password protected? And so to get answers to these questions, to be able to get a proper benchmark of the IP in an organization, it can't be done by a computer. It can't be done remotely through a question set. It has to have people asking the questions, understanding the answers, providing responses, and follow-up questions. That's my view, which is why we've been resistant or reluctant to move to an automatic question set, an online question set in our IP scorecards. But also what it does do is it allows, at the end of the day, you need to engage with people. And so it allows our team to engage with people and gives them the opportunity to meet the companies to even learn a little bit as they're completing the question set, rather than just completing it and thinking they've given all the right information and then getting either a disappointing score out of it because they didn't answer the questions correctly, or maybe they get a flattering score out of it because again they didn't answer the questions correctly. So I think the human interaction when it comes to IP is really important, particularly when IP has an impact right across a business with a whole bunch of different people in the business. I hope that makes sense, and I know that was a long-winded answer, but hopefully that answers the question.
I think it does. I think that's exactly right. So AI is just a tool.
Yeah. Okay, our last session then is sort of bridging the gap and articulating IP value to stakeholders, practical tips for business leaders. I talked while you were off, Matt. We talked a little bit about that because it was a question that had come up about IP benchmarks and how often should you get valuations and scorecards completed. I talked about why you ought to think about it both from internal demand for that data and those valuations, as well as external demand for the data and valuations. What I will say to you is that as managers of IP, as creators of IP, I think it's important that you understand how that IP is understood by other parties within your organization and by partners, by customers, and particularly in early stage. So So, for example, when it comes to IP valuation, when we are doing, everybody knows what an upside valuation is. A fair market value. It's the highest and best use valuation. You take a set of forecasts for the business and you project those forecasts forward, and then you say, hey, looking at the IP portfolio that the company has, do we think it has the right portfolio to help them achieve those forecasts? Or is there something missing in the portfolio that gives us some doubt about their ability to achieve those forecasts? And you might think, well, what does that mean? Well, if the forecasts say that they're going to break into new international territories, do they have the right IP to do that? Is that IP protected now? Or is it IP that they know they're going to create and file and protect over the next 12, 18 months in anticipation of breaking into those markets and earning those revenues? So understanding that internally is important, and understanding that externally is important, because lenders and investors will want to know that information. Secondly, it's also important to then think about how you're benchmarking the IP that the company either owns or has the rights to, and you're trying to benchmark that as part of the valuation process. And so we've seen some others benchmark the IP. So what do I mean by benchmarking, and why is that important in valuation? Well, what I'm really talking about is the relief from royalty method of valuation. And so the notion there is that valuers, IP valuations and IP valuers would be focused on, hey, if the company in question didn't own the IP, what would it cost them to license in similar IP in the market? And that means you then have to go to third-party databases to look at license agreements and comparable royalty rates. Now, we've seen evidence where some valuers will get a bundle of license agreements that look broadly comparable, but here's the truth: can you as an innovator or a new business that's innovating, breaking new ground, filing patents, creating technology in a sector, are you really going to find comparable agreements from 5 years ago, 10 years ago? No, you're not, because your IP is so new and breaking new ground. And so the mistakes that we see made are that those benchmarks don't really use comparable royalty rate agreements. I think it's really important for when you're benchmarking that you actually look at the agreements, you look at the quality of the IP, you look at the markets in which the IP in those license agreements is being used. Are they the same markets? You look at the uses of the IP. You then look at the terms of the license agreement. Are they between connected parties, where it's one entity licensing the IP to another entity within the group, but it's a reported license and it looks like a legitimate license, and it's got a royalty rate and some payments in there as well. So it is really important when you're benchmarking that you understand exactly what you're benchmarking against. And as a result, we've often found on the benchmarking side, and this notion of articulating IP value is where you can demonstrate that your IP has a greater value or is worth more than the IP you're benchmarking against. And the only way you can do that is you've benchmarked your own IP. You've got some independent analysis, you've got the tools, and therefore you're able to draw those comparisons and therefore communicate the higher value of your IP versus the comparables, which are often from old license agreements that are in the marketplace. So that's something that's often lost, so if you're getting IP valuations carried out, I think it's really important that you look at those benchmarks and comparables that are being used and ask yourself, hey, are they really true benchmarks for us to use to look at and independently assess our IP portfolio? Or should we actually be doing a bit more work in order to demonstrate the unique value or the differentiation and value of our IP versus the benchmarks? So that's important in that process of articulating value. I'll give you one other.
Do you think, and potentially,
Sorry,
Stephen, to cut you off. Do you think we should try and as we've got business leaders here, take some questions from them and articulate to them.
Sure. Let me look at what we've got.
Kate might have them somewhere.
Oh, I can see them actually in the chat function. Oh, the brand and Jaguar's rebrand. Oh, I don't know if I want to get into that. The rebrand. Well, here's an interesting thing. We actually went through a rebrand about 4 years ago. And why was that important? Because the brand that we used was created 22 years ago when I first set up the business. And at the time it was a good brand. It was differentiated, it was different, and helped us build our brand and reputation. But now, but 4 years ago, our brand was a bit tired, it was a bit dated. And more importantly, I don't think, as the team said, did it really reflect the brand that we are today? Did it really reflect the values of the business? Did the brand help articulate that? And so the rebrand then became really important for us to build our new brand guidelines around that. So what were, ultimately, what was important to us as a business? What was important to our customers? What was important to our stakeholders? How did that feed into our brand proposition and how our brand was reflected, both in terms of an image and in terms of the communications that we had and the strap lines that we used and how we communicated about the brand in our marketing materials. And so I guess the point I'm trying to make is that often people will get, when they think about a rebrand, they might get hooked on, the new Jaguar car. Do they like the color of it? Do they like the shape of it? That's just one part of the rebrand. The rebrand, can be much more important than that, because it can be about how does it reframe the brand in the market, and with the stakeholders they have now, and with the stakeholders and customers and others that they want to communicate with in the future. So I guess I've kind of dodged the question of giving you my view on the Jaguar new brand, and just giving you some ways of trying to think about rebranding and all the things that go into that. Hopefully that's kind of answered the question.
I'll dodge it too and say I'll let you know in a year's time.
There's nothing can beat the classic lines of an old E-type Jaguar, a 1967, 68 Series 1. They were classics.
I love it. I think we have time for maybe one more question from the audience, and then we will wrap it up and let Stephen and Matt have some concluding thoughts. So picking at random from the various questions we did get throughout the session, I see one here from Sriram. Excuse me if I pronounce your name wrong, but the example suggested about the use of IP in distress situations, such as impending cash shortages. What are some tools for using IP portfolio valuation in business dev?
So we talked about IP, the understanding IP valuation in a downside scenario. So that's OLV, FLV, as opposed to IP valuation in an upside, which is fair value. How is IP valuation important in biz dev? I think there's a couple of things. What we've seen is that both IP scores and IP valuations can be helpful to different teams within an organization. And I can think of in our IP 100, which is our marketing platform, league table of rich companies. One of the companies there, which was a laser business, software driven, software and technology were a big part of what they did. And when they did the IP score, these guys, they had tons of patents. Let's not get into that. But one of the things was the CEO said, hey, the outcome of the IP score was really surprising and great internally. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the software team saw that they got a great score. The score ranked the quality of software development, the level of software protection in place, and risk protection that they put in place. He said, they scored really highly in software. He said, and the software team were thrilled because no one had actually told them, hey, you're doing a great job. You're creating software that's really valuable as a piece of IP in this business. He said, so getting that external validation was important. He then said that their sales guys, when they looked at the IP score, opened their eyes a little bit and said, hey, we really ought to build our IP differentiators into our sales pitch and into our marketing materials. We should actually build it into the bids that we're making. Because actually, when you look at they said, when you look at our IP score versus our competitors, actually, when you look at it, we've got a lot more patents than our competitors, and they seem to be highly rated. Actually, we've got some highly rated software, and we don't think our competitors have got that. And so when our competitors are bidding for work, they're bidding on the basis of, hey, we're much bigger. We've got offices all over the world. We've got people in all these offices. We've got this heritage, blah, blah, blah. He said, but they don't talk about patents and software and the value of those, or the ratings of those as assets, and the independent accreditations and kind of valuations or validations of those assets. And so their sales and marketing teams built that messaging into the bids that we're making for new work and into their marketing materials. He said, so actually, the IP score really opened the eyes to sales and marketing so that they were more aware of the strength of their IP, the importance of the IP, and they had some good narrative around that they could build into their business development activities. So I don't know if that kind of answers the question, I hope.
I think so. And unfortunately, we are out of time for questions now. But I did see there were
value isn't always monetary. Sorry, Kate, my internet's gone.
That's okay. Hopefully the storm is not too bad, but we've reached the end anyways. So thanks for bearing with some funky Wi-Fi. But I want to say thank you to Stephen and Matt for breaking down the journey from innovation to investment. I think whether funding or partnerships or just business strategy, we've all learned something or some sort of strategies for working with investors, lenders, as well as even your internal business stakeholders, making the most out of our IP and intangible assets. So thank you both. I really appreciate you being here.